We will not bow down. Let my people go. We will not bow down. Let my people go. We will not bow down. Let my people go. We will not bow down. Let my people go. We will not bow down.
Well, hello and welcome to episode 82 of the Croydon Constitutionalist podcast, bringing classical liberalism to South London and beyond via our YouTube channel and wherever you get your podcasts. My name is Dan Heaton and my partner in podcasting today is Mike Swaddling, the co-founder of the Croydon Constitutionalist. Mike, it's been a while. How are things with you?
Yeah, good, Dan. We've been busy, both individually and as an organisation. So, it has been a while since we've done a podcast, but the sun is broadly shining in between the showers, and the weather's warmer and all is good with the world.
Splendid. Well, we're delighted to be joined today by Simon Richards, the former CEO of the Freedom Association. Simon, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for kindly inviting me on.
So, Mike, as I said, it's been a while, but what are we going to talk about today?
Well, we've had local elections outside of London and some other parts of the UK, but yeah, most of the UK's have been in local elections, so we'll have a chat about them and the results that have come out of them. There's been a delay in removing EU laws, and I think there's still some questions around Brexit and the delivery of it, so we'll have a chat about that. And of course, most importantly, we'll have a chat with our guest, Simon.
Indeed. So, yes, the polls have not been looking very good for the Conservatives for some time now. And there was the local elections a couple of weeks ago, and they took a kicking, losing over 1,000 councillors nationwide. Very much looking like this is going to be Labour's general election to lose from what I can see. Although, to be fair, it looks as if the spread of those Conservative defeats, the people who've gained, as it were, does seem to have been spread out somewhat. Mike, what did you make of the national picture?
Well, I think it's telling that the Conservatives' expectation management of losing 1,000 seats, and they've done worse than that. This is obviously the same seats they fought in 2019, which was a particularly bad election for them. And as you say, Labour didn't do quite well enough to guarantee a majority at the next election. Now, you can't guarantee, but what all the pollsters are saying, all the people that understand this, is Labour needs to do a little bit better. And the commentary that's gone far and wide, which is that people are fed up with the Conservatives and they're not prepared to come out and vote for them, but Labour haven't sealed the deal, does seem to be a fair commentary. I do think there's probably a lot of people in these elections that voted Lib Dem and Green that will vote Labour at the next general election. And obviously some of these were held in areas where you won't get a Labour candidate standing because they're very rural areas. People would have voted Lib Dem and Green, but they might be in a constituency that Labour can win at the next election. So that bodes quite well for Labour. I guess the big question is, will all those people that stayed at home come out and vote for Conservatives in 2024? I don't know. It doesn't feel that likely to me, but we shall see.
Simon, what did you make of it all?
I pretty much agree with your estimates on it, but just with a slight caveat that, I've been around and seen a lot of sort of midterm disastrous local election results for the incumbent party, and this wasn't the worst. And above all, I do think, whilst you're absolutely correct that this is Labour's to lose, I do think the government's not in as bad a state as, for example, John Major's government was in '97. I think the likelihood is that the economy is going to improve. The Tories have got a year to start actually implementing some Conservative policies if they choose to. And I think when people start to look at, when people start to change from just grumbling about the pretty useless government to thinking, well, is Labour going to be any better? I think that's when the polls are going to start changing. So, it's obviously Labour are favourites, but I do think if the Conservatives, do some things right, they could still win this.
Yeah, and we'll perhaps go on a little bit later to discuss what they could do right, as it were. But there were a few sort of interesting results though around the country. Reform UK won a few seats, 6 seats spread over 2 wards in Derby, 3 in Alveston North and 3 in Alveston South. And there was a victory for the SDP on Leeds City Council in the Middleton Park ward, which is interesting because they won a councillor in that ward this year, and they won a councillor in that ward last year. So obviously they're doing some good campaigning on the ground there. But obviously the elections were not in Croydon or in London, but there were some results from nearby. Mike, what did you make of the results in neighbouring areas?
Yeah, I'm particularly interested in local in the smaller parties. As Dan, we've obviously done a lot of work with them, and we will come on to mention this. But we interviewed a number of people from smaller parties, Christian People's Alliance, Reform, SDP, Foundation, and we asked many others. And you know, the first thing I'd say is just the lack of candidates outside of the mainstream parties was really prevalent. Now, there are a number of independent groups and local groups that are involved in our nearby areas. So some of them, you know, did do pretty well. Tandridge is interesting. They had a lot of candidates from local residents association type organisations who did particularly well. Interestingly, I've looked through Tandridge. I can't see anyone from SDP, Reform, Heritage, any of the smaller parties we perhaps dealt with, even UKIP, who did at one time do okay in that area, standing anywhere there. Conservatives did pretty badly, but that has been the case for a while. If you look at just been looking at Sevenoaks, an area you would expect the Conservatives to do quite well, and indeed they did. But again, no one from any of the smaller parties. There wasn't a lot of choice for people in terms of who they voted for. We did see a candidate. Indeed, we'd interviewed him down in Hawley, which is part of Reigate and Banstead. Chris Scott. Indeed, he was the only Reform Party candidate to stand in Reigate and Banstead. He came last, unfortunately, but you know he stood in Hawley Central and South. But interestingly, the local council didn't post his result for a few days until he chased them a couple of times, which is a little embarrassing for them. But yeah, you know, generally locally, the Conservatives failed to deliver in areas that should have been good for them. But other than some independent local groups, nobody really put up a fight.
That seems to be the case, yes, Mike, in the neighbouring districts sort of to the south of Croydon.
Just say one more thing on it, Dan. I think there's an interesting thing about how parties have reacted to their local wins. I'm not the first to comment on this, but Reform have really kind of made very little of the fact they've won some seats. Possibly rightly so, because these were people that previously won in that area under UKIP, I believe. And Reform had a generally pretty bad election, but the SDP have made quite a song and dance about winning, you know, and good on them. Heritage Party, who won some parish councillors, which is not necessarily the greatest effort. I don't know how many actually even had to go through the process of a count. But they've got councillors, you know, they've won something out of it, and they're making a bit of a song and dance about it. And I think that's good. That's what these parties should be doing. Pretending that you're going to go from nothing to general election victories and having an impact even on the general election is a naive view. You look at the Green Party; they won a couple of hundred extra councillors, I believe. That's a huge success, and they're not a party I like, but they've proven that to be someone that all of the parties take seriously in these you know crazy policies of theirs. Of course, they take them seriously because they're having an impact on an electoral level. And if any of the smaller parties that we kind of dealt with, call them broadly the pro-Brexit, anti-woke parties, want to make an impact, they actually have to make an impact. They have to stand candidates. And we didn't see that happen this year, unfortunately.
No, it does take hard work and dedication, and it does take time. Sometimes, it takes many, many years. Sometimes, there's, for whatever reason, there's an acceleration in your success after a few years. Something happens, and all of a sudden you suddenly get lots of county councillors. That happened with UKIP some time ago, after many, many years of fielding handfuls of candidates, but gradually increasing those numbers. And it just takes hard work. And as you say, Mike, there may be people who are in the upper echelons of parties who like to have live streams and this, that, and the other, and heavily involved in social media, but perhaps aren't putting the work in on the ground. That, I'm afraid it really is necessary. And when you've got the opportunity in local elections, which in most places outside of London happen most years in one way, shape, or form, you do need to put that work in every year. Well, we've alluded to the Conservative Party and the Conservative government and what it has been doing, or what perhaps it should do over the next 12 months if it wants to have any chance of being re-elected. And one of the promises, the pledges of Rishi Sunak was to get rid of swathes of EU law that had remained on the statute book, but not quite as quickly as had been promised. The suggestion was that these laws are going to be removed by the end of the year, but it doesn't look like it now, after Kemi Badenoch, the Trade Secretary, made an announcement on Wednesday. They're going to now just remove 800 of these regulations. It all seems a little bit too hard. Is this the blob? Is this the civil service dragging its feet? Or is it just lazy civil servants who really haven't bothered to do much work at all since the pandemic? Simon, obviously you were involved for many years in Better Off Out, and a staunch Euro realist, and later titled Brexiteer. What have you made of this announcement?
It was disappointing, wasn't it, Dan? I think that, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but when you look at what's happened since that glorious day, my birthday as it happened, June the 23rd, 2016, it's nearly 7 years now. It seems to me that there has been a really massive operation by the civil service, the blob, call it what you like, to frustrate Brexit, and not only the Home Office seemingly sort of actively encouraging illegal immigration into this country, and then the proposals that those illegal immigrants should be dumped mainly in Brexit voting areas, particularly in seaside towns. Is that such a coincidence? I don't think so. And you can go on right across the front. There's been, I think, a very concerted effort on behalf of the establishment to frustrate Brexit at every turn. And of course, it's the duty of the government to fight against that. The problem is, of course, most people in the government are Remainers themselves. So I think this is just the latest evidence of that. I have some sympathy with Kemi Badenoch, who I think is a genuine person, a genuine Brexiteer, but also I think a practical person. And I don't think that what she's done is that different from the way Margaret Thatcher behaved. She has strong principles, but you have to make things work properly. There's no point scrapping bills where there might be, for example, some awkward consequences, which would then be blamed on Brexit. So I think one has to do these things thoroughly and properly. And so I do have some sympathy with her on that front, but it is disappointing. So,
Mike, we've been waiting, what, nearly 7 years, as it were, since there's the glorious day. Do you think it's just lazy civil servants, or do you think there's some more malevolent intentions with this one?
I'm reminded, and local listeners will know that Gavin Barwell, or Lord Barwell of Croydon as he is now, wrote a book, and it's not often I praise Gavin, but it was actually quite an interesting book about his fight in the 2015 after the 2015 general election. No, sorry, for the 2015 general election, of how to win a marginal seat my year fighting for a political life. Of course, that didn't prove quite so good in 2017 for him, but it was quite an interesting look at the time. I wonder sometimes if the current Conservative Party is going to be all collectively writing a book called "How to Lose a Stonking Majority" or "How to Throw Away Your 2019 Voter Base," because that's what they're doing. I take Simon's point. I do think there is a concern here that there's a precedent that, as I understand it, the law that was going to be passed or what was going to change was to allow ministers to write off a lot of laws rather than everyone going through Parliament. But it does feel, how politically naive can you be to decide to deliver, no part of Brexit or every opportunity take the least Brexit option available. Rishi Sunak had promised to get rid of these laws. You could get rid of these laws and almost reintroduce them, or get rid of them all by giving them all a time span, a closure date, a date that they fall off the statute book. There's all sorts of things you could do, or even do what you've done whilst announcing the extra fishing rights or the extra thing you're going to do, something that gives us some hope that they care about those Brexit voters in any way, shape or form. And they failed to choose any of them. I don't know it's a conspiracy. I don't tend to believe in conspiracies. I'd go with just ranking competence, probably.
Let's assume it's not a conspiracy, although we obviously know that there have been moves since 2016 to stifle Brexit. We saw that in the House of Commons with Speaker Bercow, etc. But whilst I'm sure in due course, when the Labour Party's general election manifesto is published, we will no doubt go through it, perhaps not line by line, but bullet point by bullet point. But it has apparently been, or a certain part of it has been drafted and leaked, as these things are, and there are two things which particularly, well, there's a number of EU-related matters which would seem to be of concern, but in particular, how about this? If you haven't heard it, you'll like it. Not. They're going to say that anybody who is an EU citizen who has settled status gets the vote. And they're also going to extend voting to 16 and 17-year-olds. Now, if you've made a situation in which we have not diverged from the EU significantly, and will we ever do, when you've got millions of people who are not British citizens, they're not Commonwealth citizens, they would not normally have a right to vote in a general election, and they're going to give them the vote. Obviously, they have to get this. The Labour would need to win the election to do that. But that is one proposal which apparently is going to be in the Labour Party manifesto. Cause anybody any concerns?
Certainly causes me some concern, Dan. And in a way, I think it's an example of what I was suggesting earlier, that actually, as we come closer to the election, the reality of Labour will start to dawn on people who are just fed up with the Conservatives. And I have to say, at the moment, I can't see any area in which, however useless the Conservatives may have been, in which Labour is not at least as bad, in many cases dramatically worse. And I do think that is going to get home. And of course, if you look at the record, Keir Starmer's broken, and we're talking about Rishi Sunak breaking his promises. Keir Starmer has broken just about every promise he's ever made. I mean, I have to say, I would not believe a word that man said. And I think his claim that he will not take us back into the EU is utterly worthless. And if I were the Conservatives, I would be majoring on that. And so I think we're going to see more and more of these sort of things from Labour. And because the other thing one needs to remember is, when Tony Blair became Prime Minister in '97, he was actually sort of fairly Eurosceptic. And because once he'd got his feet under the table, under the desk, he was anything but. And of course, he wanted to take us. He wanted to abandon sterling to take us into the single currency. And so it's hard to believe that Starmer, who's a big Blair fan, would not follow the same view. whatever promise he might make about Brexit, I think totally worthless.
Yes, well, it'll be interesting to see whether there is a Conservative Party revolt over these delays. I know there was the Conservative Democratic Organisation held a conference as we record yesterday, down in Bournemouth, and I believe Jacob Rees-Mogg and Priti Patel were quite scathing about some of the developments. I don't know whether the Conservatives could go for another leadership election or what have you. I mean, if that was the way it was to go or not. But obviously, with the poor local election results and now these developments, it's tough times for the Conservatives. But Simon, I totally take on board what you say, because who will ever forget in 2017 when Theresa May went into an election that she didn't need to have. She called it, and it looked like the Conservatives were going to have a massive majority. And then she started talking about it's like social care and things like that, and old people having to pay for their care, and didn't go well for her on that occasion. So sometimes when because the reason that springs to mind is, it was an open goal basically for her to win that general election with a huge majority, but then she tried to sneak something into the manifesto that would be be the rights and wrongs of it aside, it would be very unpopular. And you've got Keir Starmer here with this huge lead in the opinion polls, or at least Labour has a huge lead in the opinion polls. Keir Starmer not as well supported as the Labour Party, actually. If he starts making these sort of suggestions, that will get some people's backs up. He might think, well, I've got such a lead that I don't mind losing some of that lead as long as I get these things into my manifesto, and then I can do them when I'm in.
I think that's a very good comparison, Dan, actually. And I remember that election very well. And in fact, Theresa May was doing, one of the reasons I think she was doing so well in the polls was that she had actually sort of ruled out taking advantage of those favourable polls to hold an election. She said no, she was going to go the whole distance. The minute she showed herself actually to be an opportunist and to have lied about that, even before those rather dodgy policies she tried to sneak in happened, I think she'd lost credibility with the public. And I think we all know one underestimates the British public at one's peril, and I think they don't like being played for fools. And I mean, I've got a view which, if long enough to bore you with, I could explain in detail, but I won't do that. But I've got a view that actually, if you look at every single election from 1945 onwards, I think the public got it right. Now, obviously, I mean, I've never voted Labour, so I don't necessarily want Labour to win, but I can understand that. I think the public tends, en masse, when you add the millions together, they do tend to come out with the sensible and logical results. There are good reasons, I think, for their voting. And I think they see through these things. They're not as stupid as politicians take them for.
Well, that's a good note of optimism. Which is well needed at this time. Well, Mike, I think you've got some questions for our guest.
I do indeed. So, Simon, obviously, you've done many things over the years, but we particularly know you from your involvement with the Freedom Association. So just wondered, how did you first get involved with the Freedom Association, and what were things like in those earlier days?
Yeah, Mike, I first got involved actually when I was at school. In fact, it was a friend of mine who alerted me to this thing he'd seen in the papers about this new organisation. It was actually then called the National Association for Freedom, which had the rather awkward initials of NAFF, NAF. So you can understand why they changed that. But at that time, perhaps the reason I'm a little bit optimistic now is, however bad people may think things are now, I tell you, they were a lot worse in the 1970s. It seemed that governments had lost the will to govern. And I think that was shown by the fact that the UK had joined the EU. It was a sign of despair that the ruling class in this country had given up hope in the country. I don't think the ordinary people had, but the ruling class had. And so things were an almighty mess. There was horrific strikes, and internationally, the Soviet Union was on the march. So things really were much worse then. The only two things I think that were better back then were sort of rock music and comedy. And perhaps I think we needed the rock music and the comedy to survive how grim everything else was. But so yes, I at the time, I think I had the opposite view to Tony Blair. It seemed to me that Tony Blair, obviously later on, took this view that pretty much everything Britain had done, everything about British history was rubbish and it needed to be changed with as little sort of thought as possible, just because he liked newness and modernity. And it seemed to me the opposite, really, that actually, when you looked at this country's history, we'd done pretty well. And then suddenly all of that was being chucked out the window. So I think, so I felt a certain despair that people, nobody was sort of saying the things I believed in, that individual freedom and opposing socialism. And then the Freedom Association came about, and it was founded in exactly the same year as Margaret Thatcher became leader of the Conservative Party. And the two were very closely connected. And so it appealed to me because it wasn't having to make a party political point all the time. It was being able to talk about first principles, individual freedom, the rule of law, the need to take on and defeat communism worldwide. They were all things, they were first principles that, having read my sort of Solzhenitsyn and stuff, and read my history, things that appealed to me.
No, that's interesting. I must admit, I hadn't appreciated how long the Freedom Association had been around. That's older than one of the people on this podcast, but I won't flatter them. So obviously, lots changed over those years, and you mentioned there about avoiding the party political nature of it, and I think Mr. Heaton, this might have been when you were first involved with the organisation as well. So you Simon, you sort of bridged a gap in the Eurosceptic years between UKIP and the Conservatives, and no doubt the Referendum Party and others before that. How did you go about doing that, and what were the kind of tensions and problems then?
Yeah, with considerable difficulty, I think, and perhaps not that much success either. But I felt it was important to try. I suppose going back to, was it 70s or 80s? I can't remember when Life of Brian came out, but there was a famous sketch there about, the People's Front of Judea and the Judean People's Front, the Popular Front of Judea and all that. And I think that was very relevant to the UKIP Conservative sort of anti-EU scenario. That there were people, I think, on both sides, Conservatives and UKIP, who hated each other more than they hated the enemy, essentially. There was a great deal of that, and it led me to despair. And I suppose in a way it's linked to what I'm saying now, that, however, for all the failings of the many failings of this Conservative government, in the end you have a binary choice between that and Labour. That's a reality. And I felt the same on Brexit. I passionately believed in Brexit because I fundamentally believed that this country needed to control its own affairs. Really, everything else is irrelevant. The fact that I might believe in liberal economics and the market system, which I do, isn't really relevant. I'd been quite happy to have a left-wing Labour government in this country, as long as that's what the people had voted for, and they could be removed at the next election. And Tony Benn actually was a very good advocate of that. And it seemed to me that above all, we had to get back to that. And so I just tried to do my little bit to try to keep the sort of warring parties to talking to each other and at least meeting up. So we had sort of social gatherings, we had freedom festivals, we had We had freedom zones at party conferences. We used to go to the Tory and UKIP conferences and a couple of others as well. And I think it was just to try to make what Churchill once described as better to make jaw than war. And I have to say that I do think we did our best on that, and we had our own Better Off Out campaign, which was non-partisan and was trying to bring the side together, and I do think it did help. But I was still, I have to say, disenchanted particularly in the run-up to the actual final referendum campaign, that the hatred between the two sides vying to become the official group, if you like, certified by the Electoral Commission. I mean, just we're almost unbelievable. I mean, the public has never seen just quite how bad it was. I did see that behind the scenes, and it was not pretty at all. It amazed me really in the end how we got through. But I come back to what I said about the British voters. I never had any doubt that the voters, given the opportunity, would come up with the result that they did. I think as long as they had the opportunity to have that question. So yeah, I just think it's so important always to concentrate on the major enemy, and not the people who might only disagree with your point by about 1%. But I've known people, criticise the likes of, I don't know, it might be someone like Dan Hannan, for example, to make out as though he was some kind of fanatical advocate of the European Union, just because he wasn't quite 100% as pro-Brexit, perhaps, as some of them. And that sort of thing's madness.
No, completely. It's interesting. You know, at that time, Dan and I were running a campaign in Croydon, and I know I spent a lot of time smiling and nodding as a Conservative would tell me how terrible UKIP was and Nigel Farage was, and I was a member of UKIP. Or a UKIPper would tell me how we don't want any of those Tories involved, and I'll be thinking, well, they're staffing 2 of my stalls on Saturday, so it's like I don't care, But within moral and legal confines, I don't care who. I want people out, and I want us campaigning. And it was an interesting time. Dan, you were involved in some of that around the Freedom Association at that time. Was there anything you particularly remember from that?
No, the Better Off Out campaign and the meetings we had and the social gatherings were really, really helpful in keeping people together who were either non-aligned or UKIP or Conservative. I mean, probably at the outset, many of the UKIP people at that time were ex-Conservatives, possibly may even have been still a member of the Conservative Party, which was in fact against Conservative Party rules, but I think some of them probably were. And there were certainly a lot of people who would only ever vote Conservative in, let's say, a local or a general election, but especially once Tony Blair had changed the voting system for European elections, and it was the more proportional system, the list system. Many people would vote UKIP at the European elections every time, and obviously that number grew over time. I thought it was brilliant, really, and Simon and others kept that campaign going. And when it was first set up, it was sort of looked down on a little bit. I think Simon, remind me, was there not some sort of ban on anybody any Conservative MP who signed up to the Better Off Out campaign? They were never to be a cabinet minister or something like that. There was all kinds of threats.
You're absolutely correct about that, Dan. Essentially what was intended to be a lifetime ban on anybody who signed up having any form of office in the Conservative Party being on the front bench. So the people who did, the backbenchers who did, were brave men and women, really. They put their principles above their careers, which not many politicians do. I must say, I was quite chuffed that we produced an enormous number of leaflets, and we always tried to make them very positive, and putting the positive case for leaving. And I was quite chuffed that an awful lot of UKIP people who were brilliant at actually delivering these for us said they thought they were much better than the UKIP leaflets because they weren't so
yes.
partisan and they were more positive. And so that worked very well. But I would say I think I mean at times I was equally annoyed with UKIPers and Conservatives. I think in the final analysis, I still think that there've been three really dominant political figures in this country in my political lifetime. One obviously is Margaret Thatcher. The other, much as I dislike him, was Tony Blair. He was a brilliant advocate of the usually disastrous cause he believed in. And the third, I think, was Nigel Farage. I think without Nigel Farage, I definitely don't think we'd be out of the EU now. He's like anybody, he's got flaws, but a truly brilliant man, and a phenomenal communicator on every level, and very shrewd operator. And to have achieved what he did without ever having been in Parliament is really quite phenomenal.
You mentioned, Simon, about the three, the fighting between the two campaigns. Ironically, on the ground, I felt there was one big advantage to there being those two campaigns that could never come together, which was when Vote Leave ran out of supplies, we got stuff from Leave.eu. When Leave.eu ran out of supplies, we got Better Off Out stuff, and we had some of that anyhow. Between them, we'd occasionally get some stuff from the Bruges Group or Go, which were grassroots out organisation. And it meant that we always had a supply during that election campaign of leaflets and paraphernalia, merchandise, whatever it might be, which we wouldn't have got, I don't think, from one central organisation, just because it turns out communism doesn't work. A variety of suppliers is always handy. And I know obviously there was a lot of bitterness around that, but actually in a perverse way it worked quite well. Competition works. So yeah, I think
entirely valid point, Mike, and that was the sort of flip side of it. That was absolutely to the good. And I think the other point that you made there, which is that I think it's important, is that I found that on the ground, at ground level, the workers out in the street stalls and everything, that it was a much friendlier. People actually got the need to work together there. I found far more. If the real rot started at the top. I mean, if you think of the fact that the characters involved were the likes of Dominic Cummings and Nigel Farage. No, both brilliant men in their own way, but not the easiest people. And there were others as well. And I think, on the ground, I think things actually. I think it's a fair point. Things work quite well.
Yes, no, very much so. Obviously, since the referendum, other than the lack of delivery, we've had perhaps one of the biggest changes to our freedom, certainly I've ever seen in my lifetime, was the lockdown. I don't know what your views are on that. What was reasonable, what was not so reasonable, what worked, and generally the impact ongoing from it.
Yeah, well, I was just retiring as CEO of the Freedom Association at that time, so I sort of didn't want to interfere too much with what my excellent successor Andrew Allison was doing. So I sort of kept fairly quiet then. But my own view, I suppose, influenced by a couple of things. First of all, my family is mostly of a medical background. I'm not myself, but I was growing up. Both my parents were general practitioners. My sister's a nurse and stuff. So, so I think I took the view initially that there was merit in playing safe, simply trying to limit contact with people, not claiming any real medical knowledge, but just seems to make sense to me that something will spread less fast if people don't sort of get too close to each other. And so I thought initially, it seemed that there seemed to be merit in having the lockdown, in particular. And I think it's easy to forget, what the atmosphere is like. But I'm sure you'll remember now that we were seeing all these pictures of these people dying in northern Italy, and people, on these trolleys, in corridors, just dead or dying there, and people were frightened. I think there's a massive fear factor, So I must, I thought, yeah, makes sense to do that and let's see what happened. I think my first unease came when, and I'm not blaming Rishi Sunak personally for it, but I was a bit shocked when he announced all this financial support, when he said it was going to go on until October that year. And I thought, what? I thought maybe July. I thought, give it a couple of months, 2 or 3 months. And I thought, why on earth would he, continue till October? Well, of course, actually, it was carrying on, well over a year after that, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Went on and on and on. And I think that as it went on, I became more and more wary of it. And once one saw the evidence, it took a long time for these things to become clear. There was, like in a war, there's a great deal of disinformation and confusion, the smoke of war. And once it became clear to me that, in Sweden, for example, that they were not doing any worse than anywhere else without a lockdown, I felt that there was no cause to continue it. So I think, in a nutshell, my position, not a very ideological one, I have to admit, because I simply don't claim any knowledge of, medicine. So I was reluctant to sort of, take some sort of standard principle in that respect. But my view was that I felt it was worth a try, but really, after a couple of months, it was clear that it wasn't working and should have been abandoned.
No, indeed, and it's interesting you say that. I think that's not an uncommon view of many of us on the kind of freedom side. I perhaps was kind of against it a little bit earlier in the day, but I'd certainly admit that it would have been an incredibly brave person at that time to say, "Here's all the advice to say lockdown. No, I'm not going to do it." But it took incredible foolhardiness to keep it going, and but there we go. Well, of course, we have moved on, thankfully, and we are. Once again, able to walk between the table and the bar without putting on a mask. We are allowed to enjoy a pint without having a substantial meal. I enjoyed a pint with just a Scotch egg the other day. I was obviously had a medical checkup afterwards to make sure I was okay.
But so what do you? Fundamental human right, in my opinion.
And completely, I could not agree more. That the UN Declaration of Human Rights, that should be number one. What do you think are other than adding that to the UN Declaration of Human Rights? What do you think are the big issues we face today?
Well, I think there are about 3 major ones. I think. First, in no particular order, first of all, I do think that there's a problem that the state is too big. Public spending is just out of control. And that tends to happen, I think, in a democratic system because politicians, try to garner votes by giving bribes, essentially. That, I'm not telling you to go British politicians specifically there. That's true of every democracy, I think, in the world. And what essentially happens, I think, is eventually the whole system collapses and then you go back to a bit of sanity. But that seems to me perhaps the biggest single domestic problem, that the state is simply too big. That's why because we're taxing far too much. And because of that, the economy is not growing, and it's a sort of vicious circle we're in. So I think that if Rishi Sunak can break out of that vicious circle, which actually quite rapidly can become a virtuous circle with the right action, cutting taxes and cutting spending, of course, which I think where Liz Truss, I think, went wrong. So I think that can be addressed, but it's not easy in the run-up to an election. And the second issue, I think, is a more well, I suppose they're all global phenomenons, but the second issue, I think, is the whole war, the war on our culture and the traditions and our history. A very deliberate war that's been waged by the Marxist left ever since the economic case for Marxism collapsed, in the 80s and 90s. And that's essentially coming over, I think, from America. As we know, it's taken hold. I think what Blair did, expanding the university sector, has had so many disastrous results. And you really need a government to take this on head on. And I think for those people who say, "Oh, bring back Boris," Boris was abysmal at that. Really no effort. I was so appalled. I mean, it's just a symbolic thing, but I was so appalled when there were those attacks on Churchill's statue. I mean, I'd have practically given my life to defend that statue, and the cenotaph even more so.
Yes.
Boris didn't seem to give a damn, frankly, the for all his sort of claims, there was no sense that the government was fighting to protect what actually the great majority of the public want, and that, frankly, is a vote winner for the Conservatives. I'm convinced if they actually take it on, and I actually think Rishi Sunak's been a bit better at that than Boris. Not difficult, but far more needs to be done. I think real war needs to be waged against these people who are trying to rubbish everything about our society, whether it's about people's sex identity, or it's the family, religion, the nation state, the monarchy, you name it. Everything's under attack. I always think the best form of attack back, the best form of defense is attack back.
Yeah.
And I think these people are very vulnerable because they are a minority, and most of what they're saying is absolute nonsense. So that's the second issue, and then the third, I think, major issue is the threat from essentially tyrannical powers worldwide. Put it like that. Obviously Russia and China being principal amongst those, and I think what distresses me is that in the 1980s there was real clarity. It was a communist against the freedom-loving democracies, and unfortunately, when you get the likes of I have to say Peter Hitchens and his other Putin apologists, Donald Trump himself, people like Viktor Orban, who all label themselves perhaps as conservatives. They're, in my opinion, it's a fake conservatism that says that Putin is a guy we can do business with. He's not, and again, I think we have to go back to much tougher position, and I think we need to spend a lot more on defence. And that I've always, I suppose, I mentioned the reason I joined the Freedom Association in the first place. I was very concerned about the growth of communism at the time, the threat from China is enormous. And of course, it's not about being anti-Chinese. It's just that China at present happens to have a particularly authoritarian government.
The CCP is the most murderous organisation in all of human history.
Yes, that's absolutely right. Yeah,
why can we not?
That stated. Yeah, no, you're so right.
When someone wears a picture of Chairman Mao, they're wearing a picture of a person that done more to murder people than anyone else ever. We absolutely should be forcefully saying that that they are. An organisation severely repressing, at best, I would call it that. At worst, it may be a genocide with the Uyghur Muslims. They want to take control of a democracy just off their shores. They seem to want to take control of the Han people everywhere with these police stations they put in foreign countries.
I mean, what the Chinese are doing, it's no different to, say, in Germany now, having people worshipping at Hitler's tomb, and them having posters of Hitler everywhere. I mean, that's inconceivable, isn't it? It's appalling.
Literally illegal as well. So which is, but no, indeed, it's.
And by the way, Mike, if I may say that it's no coincidence that the people who I used to love reading the total nerd reading the Guinness Book of Records when I was a kid. In fact, in those days, doctors, this shows how times have changed. Doctors, GPs, used to receive a free copy every Christmas because you could still prescribe Guinness on prescription then. My great aunt lived well into her 90s on that, and so I used to read the Guinness Book of Records long before I knew that the people who set it up, Ross and Norris McWhirter, went on to set up the Freedom Association.
Yes.
I remember reading all those figures, looking at those figures, saying that actually, yes, it was Mao's China that was the biggest killer of all. I think there's some dispute about whether Stalin or Hitler sort of came second. You can argue these cases, but it was all there, very carefully detailed. But as you say, the great majority of the establishment just sort of is in denial about it.
Very, very much so. So yeah, thanks, Simon. That's been really good.
Thank you so much. Real pleasure. It was kind of you to ask me on.
Yeah, and it's clearly there's a lot's been done in the past, and there's a lot still to do. So it takes people to join and work with organisations like the Freedom Association and, of course, the Croydon Constitutionalists. So we'll continue to do our bit. Well, Mike, we've got quite a few articles on our website since we last spoke with our audience. What highlights have we got there?
Yeah, so we've got a number of articles interviewing candidates who stood in the local elections. Obviously, perhaps a little bit gone now, but worth a read. Interesting to hear from different parties and people that are standing up for them. If we do believe in putting some pressure on the Conservatives and possibly putting some pressure on future governments, we do need more people to stand, and that's for a variety of parties. So that's good to see. Interestingly, something Simon said there about two sides in the same cause hating each other more than they hate the opposition. You can sometimes get that feeling when you speak to them. Not the people that wrote for us, but more generally. But yeah, some really interesting articles. Closer to home, I wrote up a summary of the Penn report. Now, it's an incredibly long summary, I will admit to that, but it's the Penn report is incredibly long. Penn report was a report into Croydon Council and some of the failings that led to its initial bankruptcy. I'll just give you one quote from it, but it really summarises the absolute disaster zone that was Croydon Council and that we will be paying for many years to come. This quote is, "There are no formal records or details that anyone was keeping an eye on the 200 million of legal loan agreements to Brick by Brick being the local building company set up by the council. That's 200 million. Nobody knew what was going on with it." Lots of information like that, worth a read if you're interested in just how badly Croydon went wrong. We met up with Simon a few weeks ago at the inaugural Freedom Festival. So this was held at the Margaret Thatcher Centre in conjunction with the Freedom Association up in Buckingham. Really interesting day and a good night afterwards. We had dinner with the Home Secretary. Okay, there was a few more than just us, but we had dinner with the Home Secretary and lots of interesting speakers. There's a few highlights from the day on our website. You can have a look through and see some of the people that spoke and possibly think about getting involved to come along next year. On a more cultural front, I wrote a little article on Bugsy Malone film called "You Give a Little Love." Now you're all singing along, no doubt, to that, or humming along to it. Yeah, just really about the movie and the kind of entertainment it gave us that we don't see out of Hollywood so much these days. So if you're interested in more cultural things, maybe give that a read and let me know what you think. We interviewed Ian Taylor of the Alliance of British Drivers. There's lots of news at the moment around ULEZ and low traffic neighbourhoods and generally a war on the car. And Ian was involved in the foundation of the Alliance of British Drivers, previously involved in other campaigns for freedom. Really interesting article on what they do and how he got involved in all of that. So, yeah, if you're interested in your freedom to travel, worth getting involved. One item on an upcoming event, and Wednesday, the 17th of May, so only a few days as we record this away, at the George, our usual third Wednesday drink. So the third Wednesday of every month, we're at the George. 7 p.m, the George in Croydon days. Come along and join us for a drink. We'd be great to see you. And we hope soon to announce a new Liberty event, a new evening we'll be putting on pretty soon. Now, we've had some problems with venues. We think we've got somewhere now. So we'll tie that up and we'll be letting you know more about that. So look out for that.
Well, if you'd like to write for our website or have any stories you'd like us to cover, please do contact us. You can do so via the Twitter at CroydonConst, via our Facebook page, via our website, CroydonConstitutionalists.uk, or via email, CroydonConstitutionalists@gmail.com. Well, do please subscribe to the podcast and the YouTube channel. Do please like, share, and leave a review. It's always good to get feedback, and it helps others to find the podcast. Well, thank you once again to Simon for joining us. It's been great to have a chat and catch up on old times. And we'd like to thank you all for listening. Until next time, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.
Stay free, everybody.